Imagine you have a neighbor. You don't know them that well, but your cameras point in the direction of their yard. And one day officers show up and they say, we want the footage. You don't know what crime they're accused of. You don't know what they've supposedly done wrong. And so you ask for a warrant. This isn't hypothetical. This happened to homeowners who had Ring installed. And what law enforcement did next was chilling. They didn't just come back with a warrant. They came back with a warrant so broad that it captured the footage from the inside of the home, simply because they asked for a warrant and asserted their rights. Hi, I'm Albert Fox Cahn. I'm a civil rights lawyer, technologist, and activist, but above all, I'm a privacy advocate. And today we're going to talk about the 5 levels of surveillance, going from the spaces where we're least surveilled to most. Level 1, your home. You may think no place is more protected than the space you live in, the space you sleep in, but the technologies we buy to make our life more convenient are making our lives more vulnerable. We see smart home locks, smart devices, keeping a log of where we are and when we leave the home. A simple tool like an Alexa that's used to control the blinds or control the thermostat, and suddenly those records are being used to put people behind bars. And when law enforcement go to those tech companies with a warrant, with a subpoena, recordings can be given over to law enforcement, sometimes without even notification to the person who owns the device. Our homes continue to have the strongest protections under our legal system, but they're under threat. We have choices to make about what technologies we're going to install and what information we're going to hand over. Level 2. Non-commercial buildings and secondary spaces, places where you go to do basic parts of life. You may think that a house of worship is a safe place, but more and more parishioners are being surveilled in the pews, facial recognition being aimed at their faces in a place that's about as private as you can get. But sadly, this isn't just happening in churches. It's something that's invaded nearly every facet of our life. During the pandemic, we saw the rise of remote proctoring. When I was taking tests as a kid, it was stressful enough, but imagine that you're sitting down to take an exam and you have to install software on your computer that will lock down every function on that device, which will require you to move a camera to monitor your entire room and which will penalize you if you look off camera for even a moment. When your boss installs a new productivity monitoring software and is monitoring how you spend your day, every keyboard click, every time you move your mouse, most employees don't have an ability to say no. Oftentimes, employees aren't willing to walk off the job and students aren't willing to find a new school in response to this technology, but coming together, we can demand better. We've seen unions and other employee groups push back against some of the worst forms of technology. So we've seen parent-teacher associations and student groups push to end remote proctoring. In level 3, we're looking at semi-public spaces, the stadiums, the stores, the other places where we are spending money, and that money is fueling the surveillance that's aimed at us. Here in New York City, we saw Madison Square Garden's owner, James Dolan, targeting lawyers who represented people who sued Madison Square Garden. In one case, a mother who was going to the Rockettes with a Girl Scout troop was banned from the show because her colleagues were involved in a case against Madison Square Garden. Imagine you're going into the store. You're walking down the aisle and suddenly you see an officer coming towards you. An officer who you think is just going to pass you by, but suddenly is pushing you up against the shelves and starting to pat you down, put you in handcuffs, and arrest you. Arrest you for trespassing in a store that you've been banned from. The only problem is you were never actually banned. The store is using facial recognition, and the facial recognition got it wrong. That's a reality in a growing number of stores and stadiums and other private businesses across the country, places that are free to use new forms of surveillance as they want, and oftentimes don't even have to disclose it to their customers. In a recent settlement with the Federal Trade Commission, Rite Aid, the pharmacy chain, admitted to making mistakes thousands of times in its facial recognition searches. We always have a choice about where we spend our money. And unlike the schools that we're coerced into attending, and unlike the price of quitting a job, we oftentimes have the ability to choose to go to a store that doesn't use this same technology. Level 4, public spaces. Few things can feel more open than the public street, the public park. Anyone can go there for nearly any reason, and yet we see that these open spaces are increasingly becoming corridors of control, from the facial recognition that logs our faces to the automated license plate readers that track our cars. New York City is one of the worst offenders, having invested billions of dollars in tracking nearly every corner of our city and subjecting it to layers of surveillance that previously was unthinkable. You can't take Uber or Lyft because all of the car share services, well, they also keep records of everyone's movements. We have just a few years before the level of surveillance in these public spaces is so great that we lose that opportunity in order to hide our identities and maintain our autonomy when we're out in public. Level 5, travel and transit. The space where we are most heavily surveilled. When we look at the way we're monitored in the air, and increasingly even on trains and buses, it's a warning sign for the way that we can be surveilled in our society as a whole. More and more we see those coming into the United States being subjected to a digital strip search, where every laptop, tablet, and phone they own is being opened by law enforcement, the contents copied, social media lives being analyzed and scrutinized just to come into the country. Recently, we heard about one Norwegian student who allegedly was turned away simply because he had a meme of J.D. Vance. We have heard about others being turned away from the US because they share political stories that CBP officials dislike. Our airports have been transformed into surveillance testing grounds over the last few decades. Imagine that your flight got delayed. You're jet lagged, you didn't sleep much, you wouldn't be in a good mood, but now imagine instead of just being in a bad mood, you're in a holding cell that you got detained in because airport security, the federal agents at customs, at immigration, ran your expression through an algorithm. Software designed to determine who's a threat and who's okay to let into the country. It's the thing of science fiction, but it's also been something that TSA and other federal law enforcement has experimented with. Software designed to read people's micro-expressions to determine whether or not they were a threat. For those traveling abroad, you can't control what information is collected at the border. You can't control what data the airlines share, but you can control what devices you take. The easiest way to opt out of these threats is to simply not travel with devices that law enforcement can seize, to travel without the information that could put your ability to come into the US at risk. When we look at the different levels of surveillance, the different places that we're potentially being monitored, the trade-offs are always different. The risks are always different, but the fight is always the same. The fight to push back against the ever-encroaching surveillance that is watching ever more of our lives. There's always steps we can take to safeguard the privacy that once was taken for granted, but now seems all too at risk of becoming a relic of the past.